March 21st, 1943. Bay of Biscay, 47 degrees north, 6 degrees west. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock stood on the bridge of U-96, breathing in the salt air of a moonless night. The diesel engines rumbled beneath his feet as his boat charged its batteries on the surface, a ritual that had kept German U-boats alive since the war's first days. His lookouts scanned the darkness with Zeiss binoculars, searching for the telltale exhaust plumes of approaching aircraft. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. The Metox radar detector, mounted on the conning tower and nicknamed the Biscay Cross by the crew, remained silent. 7 miles away, invisible in the darkness, a Royal Air Force Coastal Command Wellington bomber had already locked Type 2 71 centimetric radar onto U-96's hull. The crew had 12 seconds before the aircraft would be overhead with depth charges. They didn't know. The technology that had protected them, the assumption that radar waves could be detected before aircraft arrived, had become obsolete in a single technological leap. The British had changed the rules of engagement without announcement, without warning, and German submariners would die by the hundreds before their commanders understood what had happened. This is the story of how 10 centimeters of wavelength destroyed Germany's greatest strategic weapon, and how the men who sailed beneath the waves discovered, too late, that the ocean's darkness no longer offered sanctuary. Between May 1943 and May 1944, the Kriegsmarine would lose 245 U-boats. Most crews never understood what killed them. They simply ceased to exist between one radio transmission and eternal silence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The central question that haunted every U-boat commander in the spring of 1943 was simple. How were Allied aircraft finding submarines in total darkness? The Metox detectors worked perfectly. They had been detecting ASV Mark II radar since their introduction in August 1942. U-boat crews religiously monitored the receivers, diving immediately when the distinctive warning tone indicated radar illumination. This doctrine had proven effective for 8 months. Survival rates for boats crossing the Bay of Biscay, that deadly 400-mile transit between French bases and open Atlantic hunting grounds, had actually improved. Then, in March 1943, U-boats began dying in darkness. No Metox warning, no visual contact with aircraft. Just sudden, catastrophic attacks from aircraft that appeared without prelude. Crews who survived these attacks reported the same bewildering pattern. Running surfaced under excellent conditions, good visibility, alert lookouts, functional Metox detector showing no contacts, then aircraft overhead dropping depth charges or bombs before the diving alarm could even sound. The attacks came with such speed that most boats never fully submerged. Aircraft caught them in the vulnerable transition, conning tower hatches still open, diesels still engaged, compressed air venting as tanks flooded. The depth charges detonated alongside partially submerged hulls, fracturing pressure hulls and sending 50 men to deaths measured in seconds rather than the prolonged agony of a disabled boat sinking slowly beyond crush depth. Part 2. Building the World, U-Boat Doctrine. To understand the catastrophe that befell the U-boat arm in 1943, one must first understand the operational doctrine that had made German submarines the most effective commerce raiders in naval history. The U-boat was not, despite popular imagination, primarily a submerged vessel. It was a surface raider that could submerge when threatened. This distinction was not semantic but fundamental to every aspect of U-boat design, crew training, and tactical employment. The Type 7C U-boat, the backbone of Germany's submarine fleet with 703 examples built during the war, spent roughly 90% of its operational time on the surface. This was not preference but necessity dictated by physics and engineering. The twin MAN diesel engines, generating 2,800 brake horsepower, could push the boat to 17 knots on the surface, while simultaneously charging the massive battery banks that powered the electric motors for submerged operations. Underwater, those same electric motors could manage only 7.5 knots for a maximum of 80 nautical miles before the batteries exhausted and the boat was forced to surface. These numbers meant that a U-boat's effective operational radius, its ability to reach distant hunting grounds and return to base, depended entirely on surface running. A boat operating in the mid-Atlantic, 1,000 miles from its French base, needed to spend the vast majority of its patrol on the surface simply to position itself where merchant convoys might be found. Submerging was a defensive measure, a temporary refuge from aircraft or surface escorts, not a normal cruising mode. This operational reality shaped every aspect of U-boat tactics. Boats hunted on the surface, where lookouts with excellent optics could spot convoy smoke at 20 miles. They attacked on the surface whenever possible, where speed and maneuverability allowed multiple torpedo shots and rapid repositioning. They transited on the surface, racing to intercept positions radioed by U-boat headquarters in Lorient or by other boats already in contact with convoys. The night surface attack had become doctrine, refined through 3 years of combat into a precise tactical system. U-boats would shadow convoys during daylight hours from beyond visual range, tracking by hydrophone and periodic periscope. Observations. After sunset, they would surface and race ahead of the convoy, positioning themselves for night surface attacks that exploited the U-boat's low silhouette against the dark ocean. British escorts, their radar unable to distinguish surfaced submarines from wave clutter and their sonar useless against surface targets, found these attacks nearly impossible to counter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm and later commander-in-chief of the entire Kriegsmarine, had built his entire strategic concept around these night surface attacks. His doctrine called for wolf pack tactics, groups of 15 to 20 boats concentrating against a single convoy, all attacking on the surface in coordinated waves that overwhelmed escort defences through sheer numbers. This system had nearly severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline in 1942, sinking over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The key to survival in this surface warfare doctrine was early warning of air attack. U-boats were helpless against aircraft when caught on the surface. The deck gun, an 88mm weapon effective against merchant ships, was useless against aircraft approaching at 150 miles per hour from above. The boat's only defense was crash diving, flooding tanks and submerging before aircraft could close to attack range. A well-trained crew could clear the bridge and submerge to periscope depth in 30 seconds, to safe depth of 60 feet in 45 seconds. But this defense required warning. Lookouts needed to spot the aircraft at sufficient distance, or radar detectors needed to sense the radar emissions before aircraft reached attack range. This requirement drove German radar detector development and deployment. Part 3. Building the World, Metox, and the Illusion of Safety. First German radar detector, called Metox after its French manufacturer, entered U-boat service in August 1942. The device was crude by later standards, a simple receiver tuned to detect the 1.5-meter wavelength emissions of British ASV. Mark II radar, the standard radar equipping Royal Air Force Coastal Command aircraft. The receiving antenna, a distinctive cross-shaped affair mounted on a wooden pole that could be raised from the conning tower, earned the nickname Biscay Cross from U-boat crews who first employed it during Bay of Biscay transits. Metox was never sophisticated technology. The device detected radar illumination but provided no directional information and no range estimate. When the receiver detected ASV Mark II emissions, it simply produced an audio tone in headphones worn by a dedicated operator stationed in the control room. The tone's intensity increased as the transmitting aircraft approached, giving the operator a crude sense of whether the threat was closing or receding. That was all. No display, no sophisticated processing, just a tone that meant one thing: dive immediately. Despite this simplicity, Metox proved remarkably effective. ASV Mark II radar, operating at 1.5-meter wavelength, could detect a surfaced U-boat at approximately 12 miles under optimal conditions. The Metox receiver, being passive and thus not limited by the need to receive reflected signals, could detect ASV Mark II transmissions at approximately 20 to 30 miles, depending on atmospheric conditions and the aircraft's altitude. This detection range advantage gave U-boat crews 10 to 15 minutes of warning, ample time to crash dive and evade. The psychological impact of Metox exceeded its tactical value. For the first time since aircraft had become a significant anti-submarine threat, U-boat crews possessed a defense that didn't rely on human eyesight. Lookouts, no matter how alert, could be defeated by clouds, haze, or simple human fallibility. Metox was tireless, scanning continuously, detecting electromagnetic emissions invisible to human senses. Crews learned to trust the device absolutely. When Metox remained silent, they believed themselves safe from air attack. This belief became doctrine. By late 1942, U-boat standing orders required continuous Metox monitoring whenever surfaced. If the detector warned of radar emissions, the boat dove immediately, no exceptions. If Metox remained silent, boats could remain surfaced even in areas of heavy air patrol, confident that any radar-equipped aircraft would trigger the detector before reaching attack range. Survival statistics supported this confidence. U-boat losses to aircraft in the Bay of Biscay, previously a killing ground where Coastal Command had enjoyed turkey shoots against transit submarines, declined markedly after Metox introduction. Dönitz himself endorsed this confidence. In December 1942, he informed U-boat commanders that Metox had robbed the enemy of his advantage in radar location. Intelligence reports from captured British aircrews confirmed that RAF Coastal Command was indeed equipped primarily with ASV Mark II radar. The strategic picture seemed clear. Germany had defeated British radar through the simple expedient of detecting it before it could guide effective attacks. U-boat crews constructed an entire tactical framework around Metox reliability. They would run surfaced in areas where aircraft might be present, posting a dedicated Metox operator in addition to bridge lookouts. At the first warning tone, the alarm would sound, the bridge would clear, and the boat would dive to safety. Between August 1942 and February 1943, this system worked exactly as designed. Boats with functional Metox detectors survived. Boats whose Metox had failed, or whose operators had become careless, died. The German faith in Metox was so complete that when U-boats began dying in darkness in March 1943, the initial assumption was operator error or equipment failure. Surviving commanders reported attacks without Metox warning, but headquarters suspected the crews had simply been negligent, that operators had removed their headphones, or that equipment had malfunctioned. The alternative, that British aircraft had developed a new radar operating on different wavelengths that Metox couldn't detect, seemed impossible. German radar experts had assured Dönitz that centimetric radar, operating at wavelengths of 10 centimeters or less, was theoretically possible but practically infeasible. The magnetrons required to generate such high-frequency, high-power emissions were, according to German physics, impossible to manufacture in operational quantities. The technology that would destroy the U-boat arm's operational security was developed not through dramatic breakthrough, but through patient refinement of principles already understood. British radar research had begun in earnest in 1935, when Robert Watson-Watt demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft at meaningful ranges. By 1939, Britain possessed the Chain-Home Early Warning System, a network of coastal radar stations operating at wavelengths between 10 and 13 meters that could detect incoming German bomber formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But these long wavelength radars, while effective for detecting large aircraft formations, lacked the resolution necessary for anti-submarine warfare. The physics were unforgiving. Radar resolution, the ability to distinguish small objects from background clutter, depended directly on wavelength. Longer wavelengths produced broader, less defined returns. At 1.5 meters, the wavelength of ASV Mark II radar, a surfaced U-boat, produced a radar return barely distinguishable from wave clutter, detectable only under calm seas and skilled operator. Interpretation. What British research required was a radar operating at much shorter wavelengths, ideally 10 centimeters or less, where the conning tower of a surfaced U-boat would produce a clear, unmistakable return even in moderate seas. The challenge was generating sufficient power at these high frequencies. Conventional vacuum tubes, the heart of all radio and radar equipment, became inefficient at very high frequencies. The power levels required for effective radar, thousands of watts of pulsed energy, seemed beyond the capabilities of centimetric technology. The solution emerged from an unexpected quarter. In February 1940, two physicists at Birmingham University, John Randall and Harry Boot, developed a device called the cavity magnetron. Unlike conventional vacuum tubes that generated radio frequency power through electron beams in linear paths, the cavity magnetron used a circular chamber with precisely machined cavities where electrons, forced into circular paths by powerful magnets, generated electromagnetic oscillations at very high frequencies. The device was elegant in concept, and once the manufacturing challenges were solved, relatively simple to produce. The first operational cavity magnetron, tested in late 1940, generated 10 kilowatts of pulsed power at 10 centimeter wavelength. This was revolutionary. Previous attempts at centimetric radar had struggled to generate even hundreds of watts. 10 kilowatts provided more than sufficient power for effective maritime patrol radar. By autumn 1940, British researchers had installed prototype centimetric radar in test aircraft and confirmed what theory predicted. Surfaced submarines appeared on displays as clear, unmistakable contacts even in rough seas. The operational version, designated Type 271 radar, entered production in early 1941. The complete system weighed 270 pounds, dramatically lighter than the ASV Mark II's. Bulk. The rotating antenna, mounted in a streamlined radome beneath the aircraft's fuselage, scanned continuously, while the transmitter pulsed electromagnetic energy at a wavelength of 9.7 centimeters. Returns appeared on a plan position indicator display, a circular cathode ray tube where the operator could see a map-like view of everything around the aircraft out to maximum detection range. Maximum detection range for a surfaced U-boat under optimal conditions was 7 miles. This was less than ASV Mark II's 12-mile range, but Type 271 offered something infinitely more valuable: reliability. Where ASV Mark II's returns disappeared in rough seas or depended on operator skill to distinguish submarines from wave clutter, Type 271 presented clear contacts regardless of sea state. The conning tower of a Type 7C U-boat produced an unmistakable bright return on the display, easily distinguished from the dimmer clutter of wave returns. The tactical implications were profound. Aircraft equipped with Type 271 could detect surfaced U-boats at 7 miles, close to visual range in darkness, approach at 150 miles per hour, and be overhead in approximately 3 minutes. If the aircraft maintained strict radio silence and approached from the submarine's stern quarter, where lookout coverage was weakest, the first warning might be the sound of aircraft engines overhead, audible only seconds before attack. But the technology's true revolutionary characteristic was invisibility to German radar detectors. Metox was designed to detect 1.5-meter wavelength transmissions from ASV Mark II radar. The receiver's circuitry, its antenna dimensions, and its tuning were all optimized for this specific frequency band. Type 271's 9.7 centimeter wavelength was 15 times higher in frequency, falling completely outside Metox's detection range. To a Metox receiver, Type 271 might as well not exist. An aircraft could illuminate a U-boat continuously with Type 271 radar, while the boat's Metox detector remained absolutely silent, reporting no threat. British operational security regarding Type 271 was comprehensive. Aircraft equipped with the new radar were forbidden from using it over land, where a crashed aircraft might allow Germans to recover the technology. Aircrew received explicit orders never to discuss the radar's existence, even in general terms. If forced to ditch or bail out, radar operators were instructed to destroy the magnetron specifically before abandoning aircraft. The British code name for the operation introducing Type 271 equipped aircraft was Cork, reflecting the intention to seal off the Bay of Biscay to U-boat transit. The first aircraft equipped with operational Type 271 began Bay of Biscay patrols in March 1943. German U-boat headquarters had no idea the rules had changed. The killing began on March 2, 1943. U-275, a Type 7C boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Helmut Bork, was running surfaced in the Bay of Biscay en route to operations in the North Atlantic. The night was moonless but clear, visibility excellent. 4 lookouts scanned the darkness methodically, searching assigned sectors. In the control room, a dedicated operator monitored the Metox detector, headphones on, watching the crude meter that would indicate radar illumination. The detector remained silent. At 2200 hours, a Wellington bomber from RAF Squadron 172, equipped with Type 271 radar and ley light, acquired U-275 at 6 miles range. The aircraft commander, Wing Commander Jefferson Greswell, noted the clear contact on his plan position indicator and began his approach run, maintaining altitude and using radar to track the submarine while remaining invisible in the darkness. The Metox detector aboard U-275 continued reporting no threat. At 1 mile range, Greswell descended to attack altitude and activated the lee light, a 24-inch naval searchlight mounted in the Wellington's belly capable of illuminating targets at 1 mile with 20 million candle power. The sudden appearance of blinding light shocked U-275's bridge watch. Bork screamed the alarm for crash dive, but the Wellington was already overhead, releasing 6 depth charges in a perfect straddle pattern. The explosions detonated as U-275's bow dipped beneath the surface, conning tower still exposed, diesel engines still engaged. The pressure hull fractured in 3 places. Water flooded into the control room through the open conning tower hatch before anyone could secure it. The boat sank in under 1 minute. There were no survivors from the crew of 46. The entire action, from radar contact to sinking, lasted 4 minutes. The Metox detector never registered a warning. This pattern repeated with horrifying regularity throughout March and April 1943. U-167, caught surfaced on March 17th, attacked without Metox warning, sank with all hands. U-169 on April 20th, same circumstances, 45 dead. U-753 on May 30th, surprised by aircraft despite clear conditions and alert lookouts, lost with 50 crew. The reports from boats that survived these attacks shared consistent details. Aircraft appearing without warning despite functional Metox detectors. Attacks executed with such speed that crash diving offered no safety. Ley light illumination occurring at ranges where lookouts should have seen the approaching aircraft, but reported nothing until the light activated. The conclusion was inescapable but incomprehensible to German tactical doctrine. Allied aircraft were somehow detecting and tracking U-boats, without triggering Metox warnings. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. U-boat headquarters initially resisted the obvious conclusion. On March 21st, Dönitz issued orders requiring continuous Metox monitoring and immediate diving on any warning, as if the problem were crew carelessness rather than technological obsolescence. When boats continued dying despite strict adherence to these procedures, headquarters theorized that Metox emissions themselves might somehow be detectable, that the Germans' own radar detector was betraying U-boats to Allied direction-finding equipment. This theory was nonsense. Metox was a passive receiver, producing no detectable emissions, but it revealed headquarters' desperate inability to accept that British radar technology had leaped beyond German countermeasures. Some commanders reached the correct conclusion independently. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, commanding U-333, noted in his war diary after a near-miss attack in April, aircraft appeared without Metox warning. This has now happened too frequently to be explained by equipment failure. Must conclude the enemy possesses radar we cannot detect. Recommend extreme caution and immediate diving on any aircraft sighting regardless of Metox status. But Kremer's conclusion, though correct, offered no tactical solution. If Allied aircraft could detect U-boats beyond visual range using undetectable radar, then the fundamental doctrine of surface operations had become suicidal. U-boats needed to surface to charge batteries, to transit at efficient speeds, to hunt effectively. If surface operations invited undetectable air attack, then U-boats lost their primary operational advantage. The boats would become true submarines, confined underwater, limited to battery-powered operations that reduced effective range to uselessness. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In March 1943, Coastal Command sank 15 U-boats. In April, 16 U-boats. In May, the slaughter peaked at 41 U-boats lost to all causes, with air attack accounting for the majority. The Bay of Biscay, which U-boats had to cross to reach Atlantic hunting grounds, became known among crews as the Valley of Death. The odds of surviving a bay transit were dropping toward 50%. The first physical evidence of British centimetric radar reached German hands on June 1, 1943, when a RAF Coastal Command Sunderland flying boat, equipped with ASV Mark III radar, a maritime patrol variant similar to Type 271, was forced down off Norway. German recovery teams salvaged the radar equipment and transported it to Berlin for analysis. Kriegsmarine technical experts examined the cavity magnetron at the heart of the system and confronted their fundamental miscalculation. The British had not merely developed centimetric radar, they had solved the manufacturing challenges that German physicists had declared insurmountable. The cavity magnetron was elegant, relatively simple, and clearly in mass production. The implications were catastrophic. Every assumption underlying U-boat tactical doctrine, every calculation of relative advantage in the anti-submarine war, had been based on the premise that radar detectors would provide adequate warning of air attack. That premise was now demonstrably false. German responses came too late and proved inadequate. Naxos, the German centimetric radar detector, didn't enter service until October 1943, and even then only in limited quantities. The device could detect Type 271 emissions, but its sensitivity was poor, typically providing only 2 to 3 miles warning, insufficient for crash diving before aircraft reached attack position. By the time Naxos equipped most operational U-boats in early 1944, the strategic damage was irreversible. The psychological impact on U-boat crews exceeded even the staggering casualty figures. Submariners had accepted extraordinary risks as part of their service, a 75% casualty rate over the course of the war, 30,000 dead from 40,000 men who served in U-boats, demonstrated their willingness to face death. But those risks had always come with the assumption that skill, vigilance, and proper equipment could provide some measure of control over one's fate. Type 271 removed that assumption. A U-boat commander could follow every procedure perfectly, maintain alert lookouts, monitor radar detectors continuously, and still die without warning because the enemy possessed technology against which German equipment offered no defense. The randomness was psychologically devastating. Survivors reported feeling hunted by an invisible enemy, unable to trust the darkness that had once protected them, unable to believe their detection equipment even when it showed all clear. Oberbootsman Heinrich Lehmann, a senior enlisted man aboard U-224, described the psychological state in his memoir. "We knew the British could see us when we could not see them. Every moment on the surface became an exercise in controlled terror. You waited for the sudden flare of the lee light, the scream of aircraft engines overhead, the crash of depth charges. The waiting was worse than combat. At least in combat you could fight back. Against the radar, we had nothing." The operational consequences forced dramatic changes in U-boat tactics. Dönitz ordered boats to transit the Bay of Biscay submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night for battery charging, and even then only for minimum necessary time. This reduced transit speeds dramatically and cut into operational time in hunting areas. Boats that previously spent 20 days on station in the North Atlantic found themselves spending 10 days in transit and only 10 days hunting, cutting effectiveness in half. More fundamentally, the night surface attack, the tactical centerpiece of Wolfpack doctrine, became increasingly hazardous. Allied convoys, now escorted by escort carriers providing continuous air cover, could vector aircraft to surfaced U-boats using Type 271 radar. The concentration of U-boats that made Wolfpack attacks effective also made them vulnerable to concentrated air attack. By autumn 1943, Dönitz was withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely, conceding the battle for the convoy routes. The strategic implications reached beyond tactical defeats. U-boats had been Germany's primary means of striking at Allied logistics, attempting to sever the supply lines sustaining Britain and supporting the eventual invasion of Europe. The average monthly Allied shipping losses fell from over 600,000 tons in early 1943 to under 200,000 tons by year's end. The U-boat arm, which had nearly starved Britain into submission in 1942, had been neutralized as a strategic threat. The German response to Type 271 radar revealed the fundamental asymmetry between Allied and Axis technological development in the war's latter years. While Britain could deploy revolutionary radar systems across hundreds of aircraft within months, Germany struggled to produce even basic countermeasures in meaningful quantities. This disparity reflected not merely technical capability, but the crushing weight of strategic resource allocation in a losing war. Naxos, the German centimetric radar detector, exemplified these limitations. Development began immediately after the captured Sunderland provided proof of British centimetric radar capabilities in June 1943. German engineers understood the physics perfectly and designed a functional detector within weeks. But production proved agonizingly slow. Vacuum tube shortages, competing demands from Luftwaffe night fighter programs, and Allied bombing of German electronics factories meant that Naxos sets trickled to operational U-boats at a rate of perhaps 20 units monthly through late 1943. Even boats equipped with Naxos found the device's limitations severe. The detector provided only 2 to 3 miles warning of Type 271 emissions, compared to Metox's 20 to 30 mile range against ASV Mark II. At 2 miles, an aircraft traveling at 150 miles per hour would be overhead in 48 seconds. A crash dive to safe depth required at least 45 seconds under ideal conditions. The margin was essentially zero. If the Naxos operator hesitated even momentarily to confirm the contact, if the bridge watch took 5 extra seconds to clear, if the diesel engines didn't shut down immediately, the boat would still be vulnerable when depth charges detonated. Worse, Naxos suffered from what crews called false positives. The detector, highly sensitive by necessity, would occasionally register emissions from sources other than hostile radar, atmospheric interference, emissions from distant radars, even occasionally from German radar systems. After several incidents where boats crash-dived to evade non-existent threats, wasting precious battery power and disrupting operations, crews began treating Naxos warnings with skepticism. This skepticism killed them. U-boats that ignored Naxos warnings as false alarms sometimes discovered, too late, that the threat was real. The technological arms race continued through 1944, with Germany perpetually behind, when Allied forces introduced improved centimetric radars operating at 3 centimeter wavelength in spring 1944. German detectors again became obsolescent. The Tunis detector, designed to detect 3 centimeter emissions, didn't reach operational boats until early 1945, by which time U-boat operations had been reduced near irrelevance by fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied air superiority. Dönitz attempted tactical responses to offset technological disadvantage. In September 1943, he ordered all U-boats to remain submerged in transit through the Bay of Biscay, except when absolutely necessary to charge batteries. Boats were instructed to surface only during the 2 hours before dawn, considered the lowest risk period when aircraft visibility was worst and patrol densities lowest. Even during these brief surface periods, boats were ordered to crash dive immediately on any Naxos warning, any aircraft sighting, or any suspicious circumstance whatsoever. These conservative tactics kept more boats alive but eviscerated operational effectiveness. A Type 7C boat could travel submerged at 4 knots for perhaps 12 hours before battery depletion forced surfacing. The Bay of Biscay transit, 400 miles from French bases to open Atlantic, which had taken 3 days at 15 knots, surfaced now required 10 days or more of cautious submerged running interspersed with brief, anxious surface periods to charge batteries. This extended transit time reduced patrol durations correspondingly. Boats that had spent 3 weeks hunting convoys now spent 2 weeks in transit and 1 week operational before fuel consumption forced their return. The impact on crew psychology proved even more debilitating than the tactical constraints. U-boat service, always dangerous, had traditionally offered the compensation of elite status within the Kriegsmarine. Submarine crews were volunteers who received better pay, better food, and immense prestige. They were Hitler's grey wolves, the offensive arm that struck at Allied logistics even as the Wehrmacht suffered defeats on every front. This psychological sustenance evaporated in 1943. Crews now saw themselves as hunted rather than hunters, forced into defensive operations where survival depended on hiding rather than engaging. The fundamental transformation of the U-boat from offensive weapon to defensive liability destroyed the sense of purpose that had sustained crews through earlier hardships. Letters and diaries from the period, preserved in German military archives, reveal profound demoralization. Crews went through the motions of operational procedure while privately acknowledging their inability to affect the war's outcome. One U-boat commander, Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner, later described the period in his memoir. "We had become obsolete, dangerous to our enemies only when we could surprise isolated merchants, lethal to ourselves every moment we spent on the surface. The technology that had once made us invisible now made us merely slow targets. We continued operating because orders required it, not because we believed we could win." The casualty statistics from the U-boat war's final 2 years tell a story of institutional destruction unprecedented in modern naval warfare. Of the roughly 39,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, approximately 28,000 died in action, a 72% fatality rate that exceeded losses in any other branch of any military force in the war. The introduction of Allied centimetric radar in spring 1943 marked the inflection point where U-boat operations transformed from strategically significant to essentially suicidal. The numbers are stark in their progression. In 1942, before Type 271 radar deployment, German U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping while losing 87 boats, a favorable exchange rate that genuinely threatened Allied logistics. In 1943, after centimetric radar deployment, U-boats sank approximately 2.4 million tons while losing 244 boats, an exchange rate reversed so dramatically that U-boat construction couldn't replace losses. In 1944, sinkings fell to 400,000 tons against 241 U-boats lost. By 1945, U-boats were sinking negligible tonnage while boats continued dying to Allied countermeasures. These figures mask individual tragedies that illustrate the human cost. U-448, sunk by an Australian Sunderland using centimetric radar in the Bay of Biscay on April 14, 1944, carried 55 men. The boat was detected at 7 miles, attacked before it could dive, and sank with all hands. Among the dead was Oberleutnant zur See Helmut Dauter, who had survived 3 previous patrols and was on his final mission before transfer to shore duty as an instructor. His letters, which his widow donated to the German U-boat Museum decades later, reveal a man who understood the tactical hopelessness, but continued serving from duty rather than conviction. The strategic consequences of U-boat defeat extended beyond shipping protection to enable the entire Allied strategic concept for defeating Germany. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944, Operation Overlord, required concentrating millions of tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of troops in southern England, presenting a target of unimaginable density and vulnerability. Had U-boats retained their 1942 effectiveness, this concentration would have been impossible. The defeat of the U-boat arm through technological superiority, particularly centimetric radar, was therefore prerequisite to Allied victory in Europe. The irony was not lost on surviving U-boat crews. They had been defeated not by superior tactics or greater courage, but by physics. The cavity Magnetron, a device weighing less than 2 pounds, had accomplished what thousands of escorts and aircraft carriers could not. It had made the ocean transparent to Allied surveillance, removing the obscurity that submarine warfare required. German submariners, trained in a warrior tradition, emphasizing individual skill and courage, discovered that technological superiority trumped valor. This lesson influenced post-war naval development profoundly. The primacy of sensors over platforms, the understanding that detecting the enemy before he detected you was more important than armor or armament, became foundational to Cold War naval doctrine. The U-boat's defeat through radar demonstrated that information dominance, the ability to see and track enemy forces while remaining undetected yourself, was becoming the decisive factor in modern warfare. Individual survivors carried the experience into vastly different post-war lives. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, whose U-96 survived the war through extraordinary combination of skill and luck, returned to civilian life and rarely spoke of his wartime service. When interviewed for historical projects in the 1970s, he focused not on victories, but on the grinding psychological pressure of operating when detection equipment couldn't be trusted, and every surface period might end in sudden death. Other survivors found the post-war transition impossible. The suicide rate among U-boat veterans in the years immediately after the war was substantially higher than among other veteran populations, reflecting perhaps the unique psychological trauma of having been systematically hunted by technology they couldn't counter. These men had volunteered for service, expecting danger, but also expecting that their training and equipment would give them fighting chances. The discovery that Allied technology had rendered German countermeasures obsolete, that they were essentially defenseless against an enemy they couldn't even detect, produced a sense of helplessness that some never overcame. The technological legacy proved more straightforward. The cavity magnetron, developed in British laboratories and deployed in Type 271 radar, became after the war the heart of microwave technology. The same principles that had detected U-boats at 7 miles would eventually enable microwave ovens, satellite communications, and modern radar systems. The physicists who developed centimetric radar couldn't have imagined that their wartime improvisation would become foundational to post-war consumer technology, but the connection was direct and profound. Return now to that March night in 1943. Captain Lieutenant Lehmann Willenbrock on U-96's bridge, breathing salt air, watching darkness, believing himself safe because the Metox detector remained silent. 7 miles away, electromagnetic pulses at 9.7 centimeter wavelength were reflecting off his conning tower, painting a clear, bright return on a cathode ray tube display that he didn't know existed. The aircraft commander was already beginning his approach run. Lehmann Willenbrock had perhaps 12 seconds of life remaining before depth charges detonated alongside his boat. He survived, through circumstances that remain unclear even in historical records. Perhaps the depth charges malfunctioned. Perhaps the aircraft's bomb release mechanism failed. Perhaps simple luck intervened. But thousands of his fellow submariners, in identical circumstances, didn't survive. They died believing their detection equipment was reliable, that the silence of their radar detectors meant safety, that they had taken every reasonable precaution. They died never understanding what killed them. This gap between perceived safety and actual vulnerability defines the U-boat experience in the war's latter years. German submariners weren't fighting merely against Allied escorts or aircraft, but against the fundamental disadvantage of technological obsolescence. They carried equipment designed to detect yesterday's threats while facing tomorrow's capabilities. The resulting mismatch was measured in thousands of lives lost to an enemy they literally couldn't see. The broader lesson transcends naval warfare. U-boat's defeat demonstrates how technological surprise can invalidate established doctrine instantly. German naval planning in 1942, based on careful analysis of Allied capabilities and extensive combat experience, became worthless in weeks once Type 271 radar deployment began. Every tactical assumption, every operational procedure, every confidence in detection equipment was suddenly invalid. The boats continued operating under obsolete assumptions because headquarters couldn't believe, initially, that British technology had leaped so far ahead. This institutional resistance to accepting unwelcome technological reality cost lives that might have been saved by earlier tactical adaptation. Had Dönitz immediately ordered all boats to remain submerged in high-risk transit areas upon receiving the first reports of attacks without Metox warning, casualties in spring 1943 might have been lower. Instead, headquarters insisted the problem was crew carelessness or equipment failure, refusing to accept that Allied technology had surpassed German countermeasures until physical evidence from captured radar sets made the truth undeniable. The human dimension remains most poignant. The young men who crewed U-boats in 1943 and 1944 knew, from casualty statistics if nothing else, that their survival chances were poor, yet they continued volunteering, continued sailing, continued surfacing to charge batteries, even as they understood that each surface period might be their last. This wasn't ignorance or fatalism, but rather the complex motivation of soldiers in losing wars. Duty, loyalty to comrades, inability to abandon the fight while others continued it. Their experience offers no comfortable lessons about heroism or sacrifice. Most died accomplishing nothing strategically significant, sinking negligible tonnage while consuming resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Their deaths didn't alter the war's trajectory or protect their homeland. They simply died, often without warning, often without understanding what had killed them, in service to a cause already lost. The technology that killed them, centimetric radar, represented not merely British ingenuity but the cumulative advantage of Allied industrial capacity, scientific depth, and strategic coordination. Germany couldn't match, not because German scientists lacked brilliance, but because German industry, stretched across multiple fronts and subjected to increasing bombing, couldn't produce adequate countermeasures even when the technical solutions were understood. The U-boat's defeat was ultimately a defeat of systems, not individuals. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock lived until 1986, long enough to see the Cold War transform submarines into strategic nuclear platforms, to witness technology development that would have seemed magical in 1943. In his final years, when asked about the war, he reportedly focused not on the battles or victories, but on the men who didn't come home, particularly those who died in spring 1943 when attacks began without warning. He understood, perhaps better than most, that they had died not because they failed as warriors, but because they fought with obsolete tools against an enemy they couldn't detect. The 12 seconds that German submariners theoretically had after Type 271 radar locked on at 7 miles was time they never actually possessed. By the time they might have known they were detected, the aircraft was already overhead, the depth charges already falling. The gap between when they thought they would know and when they actually discovered the threat was measured in the distance between life and death. For thousands of submariners, that gap was everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.